After white supremacist Dylann Roof murdered 9 African American worshipers in an historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, authorities moved quickly to find him and bring him to justice. And when the case went to trial, it took the jury less than 3 hours to come to a unanimous verdict, guilty in all 33 counts of federal hate crime charges. But the judge who presided over the case remembers a time when justice for violent racist crimes was all but non-existent in his state. 6 decades before that judge, South Carolina Federal Court Richard Gergel, took office, one of his predecessors, Judge J. Waties Waring, presided over a long-forgotten case with a very different ending, reached in just 28 minutes. Judge Gergel tells the story in his new book, Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sgt. Woodard, and the Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge Waties Waring. He joins me now. Judge, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Delighted to be here, Jim.
Tell me who Sergeant Isaac Woodard, Jr. is and what happened to him in February of '46.
Well, he was a decorated veteran on his way home, literally on the day of his discharge. And he had an exchange with a bus driver when he thought the bus driver had spoken in an insulting way to him. And he spoke back and said, "Speak to me like I'm a man. I am a man just like you." At the next stop, the bus driver got off the bus and had him arrested and removed from the bus. And there in Batesburg, South Carolina, the police chief beat and blinded Sergeant Woodard.
Blinded him by essentially shoving his baton into his eyes.
Into each of the 2 eyes, the blackjack into each eye, yes.
And the immediate prosecution was not of that cop, that sheriff, but rather of Woodard himself.
Woodard himself
correct?
for public drunkenness, it was the claim, yes.
So, by the way, as I said to you when we sat down, I am amazed that I have not heard of the story, but in all fairness, you hadn't heard of the
Correct.
story, and you're from there recently. So, in the black press, as it was called, called the Negro press at that time, obviously, there was a decent amount of publicity. And then there was a guy who we've all heard of from War of the Worlds who talked about it on national radio. Here's Orson Welles.
When the bus got to Aiken, he got off and went and got the police. They didn't give me a chance to explain. The policeman struck me with a billy across my head and told me to shut up. After that, the policeman grabbed me by my left arm and twisted it behind my back. I figured he was trying to make me resist. I did not resist against him.
And essentially what Orson Welles did is he read from the affidavit of Sergeant Woodard, did he not?
Yes, he did, and it created a national sensation.
And ultimately it got to the desk, in part thanks to that and the words of I believe the head of the NAACP at that point, to the desk of Harry Truman. Is that not correct?
Right. There was a meeting of civil rights leaders, and President Truman was trying to explain why his administration couldn't do more for civil rights. And then Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, told him the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard. And Truman was so outraged by the story that he threw aside the prior position he had taken that there was nothing he could do and essentially ordered the prosecution of the police chief who had blinded Woodard.
And by the way, the Department of Justice, from what I learned from you in those days, was not exactly doing those kind of cases.
No, this is very rare, and it was really at the prompting of President Truman.
So he orders this federal prosecution, which happens. And as I said, it took the jury, was that right, 28 minutes?
You had it right, 28 minutes.
And what was the verdict in that case?
Of course, not guilty. All white jury, all male jury, not guilty.
And the judge in this case, tell us a little bit about this judge before he presided over that case.
J. Waties Waring was an 8th-generation Charlestonian. His ancestors had owned slaves. His father was literally a Confederate veteran. He had never shown anything. His father was a Confederate veteran. He had an uncle who died in the Civil War. He had never shown particular interest in issues of race and justice, but watching this trial shocked him, it outraged him, and it eventually led him on a journey of study and reflection which produced a transformative event in his life. He became a giant advocate for civil rights.
And that's not just a rhetorical commendation. Explain to us ultimately what his advocacy led to that virtually everybody watching the show is fully aware of, even if they never heard of any of the players besides Truman.
Right. He issues a dissent in a case called Briggs versus Elliott. It's a 3-judge panel decision. It's the first of the 5 cases that make up Brown versus Board of Education.
Wasn't Thurgood Marshall involved in that case?
Thurgood Marshall was personally involved trying the case in front of him. And Judge Waring concludes that in his dissent that segregation is per se inequality, and that the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson was wrong as a matter of law, as a matter of history, and as a matter of morality. That analysis is Brown versus Board of Education. 3 years later, they take Judge Waring's analysis, and that's the Brown decision.
And I don't think it's too grand a statement to say, had it not been for Sergeant Woodard's case, the judge in this case may not have had that epiphany.
I think it's almost certain.
And so even if that had happened, it may not have happened in that time frame. And by the way, I left out of the story, Harry Truman, who you write in your book had a solid record, of at least voting record on civil rights, was not exactly a leader. That led to the desegregation, the banning of segregation in the military. Is that not correct?
Correct. It's absolutely directly related. That is, the day after he learns of the blinding of Sergeant Woodard, he writes a letter to his Attorney General. And he says, we got to do something, which is clearly the prosecution. And secondly, we have got to proceed with a civil rights commission. That civil rights commission, never had a presidential commission on civil rights, recommends the desegregation of the military as its #1 recommendation. He adopts that by his executive order. And frankly, that is the beginning of the end of Jim Crow in America.
You know, as I said to you at the beginning, let me return to this. You know, everybody watching the show knows who Atticus Finch is, who didn't even exist. We all know he is. We all can almost recite the lines from the book, from the movie. Why did no one know, including in South Carolina, why did no one know about Sergeant Woodard and this great judge?
Waties Waring was like lost to history. When I took the oath of office in 2010, he was a forgotten figure in Charleston and in South Carolina. And I've done my part in trying to give South Carolina a background in his legacy. We now have a statue on our courthouse grounds in his honor, and the courthouse is now named for him.
Why did you have to do this, though? I mean, you're missing my point. I understand. You did wonderful work. Why did you have to do that work? When you went, did you not meet the mayor in Batesburg, in Batesburg itself, where this happened?
Never heard of it.
Who had never heard of this?
I think this is part of the story of Jim Crow. These terrible events would happen and would be immediately lost to history. Nobody would know about it. Linwood Shaw, who was prosecuted unsuccessfully for the blinding of Isaac Woodard, no one in town had ever heard he had been prosecuted.
So when you walked into Batesburg, you went back to
I
Batesburg.
did. I've been several times.
Describe that feeling when you were there for the first, when you knew you were walking the same streets that Sergeant...
Well, it's quite a story. I go there to reconstruct the event like any good trial lawyer would do. You go and you see the scene of the crime. And I walked this path from the point he got off the bus where he was arrested, up around the corner where he was beaten and blinded, and to the area where the town hall once stood where he was jailed that night. And it was a pretty solemn walk to walk that path, and the mayor walked it with me, and he was nearly in tears by the time we had finished. He had never heard the story.
And so, again, there's something dedicated in the memory of the sergeant now.
Correct. 2 weeks ago, the town erected a historic marker to the blinding of Isaac Woodard.
And as you say, your courthouse has now been renamed for Judge Waring?
Judge Waring, yes.
Are you in the same courtroom? Do you practice in the same?
I use that courtroom very frequently.
What does that feel like? What do all these things
it's amazing.
feel like
You know,
to
I'm
you?
in the courtroom where Briggs versus Elliott was tried. I am in the courthouse of J. Waties Waring, and we have the honor now of it being named for him.
Are you aware? Is that part of your consciousness? I don't mean all the time. Obviously, you're doing your work, but do you feel that?
Let me say this: it's not just me. My colleagues, judicial colleagues, feel great pride for the legacy of Judge Waring. And I'm invited to speak all over the country to my judicial colleagues. I'm going to Arkansas in a couple of weeks to speak to the 8th Circuit Judicial Conference. That's from like Arkansas to Iowa. They have no connection to Judge Waring other than this great legacy they want to recall.
Let me tell you, you've made a great contribution to history. It's really important and a wonderful book.
Jim, it's been great being with you. Yes.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. Please get the book. And by the way, you can catch the judge at the Social Law Library here in Boston on March 26th. The book again is Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard, and the Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge J. Waties Waring.